Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Agree to Disagree About Gender. I'm Laura Turgonic.
And I'm Yvette Neri.
Yeah, and I'd really like to thank you all for joining us once again today, because this is part two of an interview we're doing with Maia Poet. And so, for anyone who is unfamiliar with Maia Poet, I really encourage you to go back and check episode one. Or not our first episode of the podcast, but the episode we did before this, where we did the first part of the interview with Maia Poet. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar with who Maia is that she is a young person in her 20s who, from the ages of 12 into her early 20s, identified strongly with being a member of the male identified strongly with being a boy or a man. And she was someone who struggled with gender identity and for a period of time pursued maybe not total medical interventions or surgical interventions, but definitely social made changes to her social role and to her appearance to be recognizable as someone who was a young boy. And over time, began to desist from this identity, felt it was not the best fit for her, and is now back to living in her gender role. And what really makes Maya unique is she's really insightful about her own experience, and particularly about the influence of having a diagnosis of autism, and how this processing issue, how she believes this led for her to identify as a boy, or want to be a boy growing up, and as she came to understand this part of herself better, was integral in her desistance, and how it also shapes her current advocacy. And in the first episode, we spent a lot of time talking about her history and her development, and how she got from being a young child to adopting this male gender role, to desisting, to becoming the person she is today. And we spoke for nearly 90 minutes and barely covered a lot of the things that I really wanted to talk about, which is why we sort of agreed to come back a second time to finish that conversation. So, Yvette, what do you recall from that first from the conversation? Like, what were the kind of things that really stuck with you?
The things that really stuck out for me were how profoundly autism affected her early development. That she said that, like, most children, by the time they're 5, 6, 7, they understand that sex is constant, but she didn't really understand that until she was maybe 10 or 11, even though in other areas of her life, she's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
So her development was really hit and miss, compared to typical development.
Yeah, and I think that's often like one of these features of autism is this sort of need to try to categorize everything, to try to make yourself fit into, you think you have to fit into one area or another. And I think people who are autistic often spend a lot of time really perseverating on, when the fit isn't perfect, of, well, why is that? And what is it about these categories? Whereas other people just kind of float along and say, well, obviously I look like a boy and I'm clearly a boy, so why does this deserve any more thought than it does? And so I thought that was really sort of fascinating. And Maya is a person, and I'm not saying all people with autism are like this, who you can tell is really thinking through a lot of the things that I think a lot of people who are more neurotypical take for granted. And it probably really does affect this association that we're starting to increasingly recognize between autism, or between neuroatypicality, and this sense of having a gender identity that doesn't match your body type, or of feeling the need to really explore around issues of gender, or developing a desire to be very curious about what it's like to be a member of the opposite gender class, because it is otherwise fairly inaccessible.
Right. And socially, it has been provided, and on social media, like on TikTok and Tumblr, a lot of times, these kids are desperate to figure out why they don't fit in.
Yeah.
Why do things feel wrong? And now they are provided not only online, but also typically in public schools, this as a reason. And for many kids, it makes sense. 40 years ago, um, you know, someone like Maia 40 years ago would not have been handed this explanation.
Yeah. Like someone like Maya 40 years ago would have been me. Maybe not exactly 40 years ago, but, I grew up at a time when I obviously spent a lot of time in my childhood, exploring in my mind and trying to find information about gender and why I didn't really feel right in the gender role that I was told I was supposed to be and in the body I had. But I did not have social media, and I did not have an internet, and I did not have a school providing me with any information about this. So I kind of just sort of muddled along and tried to scrape, you know, little shreds of information together from television or from a little piece I might have read in the newspaper, an article about a trans woman or something about drag queens, and trying to piece it all together kind of randomly in happenstance. So I know we've talked about this before, how this might potentially turn some people who this isn't the best fit for onto this idea of transition, or onto this idea of being of a different gender or being transgender, where it's not in their best interests. But on the other hand, I always think that this might have been information that would have been handy for me to have at a younger age, and who knows?
Right, but it didn't mislead you.
It didn't mislead.
Maya and a lot of people are misled. Yes. Because they don't realize, these are artifacts of my autism. It's like, well, that's why I'm not a right girl. It's because I'm really a boy. I have a boy brain.
Yeah, and I think
not I'm gender atypical and autistic.
Yeah, and I think that part of the problem is that the messaging became so broad that it swept a lot of people into, into sort of this thought that they might be transgender, who likely in a different generation would not have been exposed to that and would have resolved their issue in some other, hopefully, better adaptive ways. But we also know sometimes before, what people are sometimes calling this craze, took hold, that young girls who are confused about their place in the world would find other maladaptive ways, eating disorders, other body dysmorphias, I'm not saying that transgenderism is preferred to that. I'm just saying it's not like everyone lived happily ever after, even in the absence of that. But let's bring Maia in. I know she's waiting in our purgatory space patiently for us to call her in, because she is someone who, as much as we thought about it, I think she's probably spent more time thinking about it than us. And she's always a great conversation. So let's bring her in.
All right. Hi, Maia.
Hi, Yvette. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Alive.
Well, that's one of the prerequisites for being on the show. We do screen everybody here for signs of life, and you've made it, so congratulations. So welcome to Maia. The other thing that our viewers may notice is that even though this is a two-parter, we did film this several weeks apart. You'll notice that both Yvette and Maia had the good sense of checking the tapes, or at least thinking back to what were they wearing on the day of the original taping, and making sure this matched. And I decided to go my own way today and wear a totally different outfit. So sharp-eyed viewers at home, we did not plan this out. I just decided to march to my own beat here, whereas obviously Maia and Yvette are clear conformists, and really and having continuity is super important to them. So why don't we begin by trying to pick up where we left off last time? Because as we were saying in our intro, the first time we spoke, we talked a lot about your personal journey. And we talked about sort of how you came to understand, or I guess now we would say misunderstand, gender, and why you were struggling to sort of fit in or find your place as a young girl, and found sort of some solace or some comfort perhaps in taking on this new gender role, which seemed to be a fit for a while, but eventually, as you came to understand yourself better, you recognized that this was perhaps just a strategy that you were using to address sort of feelings of why you're feeling maybe isolated, and have come to a better understanding. A lot of that came through you developing an understanding of autism, and particularly how autism shapes your pattern of thinking, and why it may have led you to think different things about your identity than someone who didn't have these traits might. So before I go further, because I don't want to that's sort of my summary of what happened. Yvette, is this kind of like what your thought, or is there anything that you sort of took out of the last one?
I mean, it was largely my thought, but my understanding of Maya's journey is that when she was coming to realize, hold it, this isn't working, this isn't my issue, this is not solving my problems, was abrupt and not gradual. it was a result of events, in Israel at the time.
So perhaps the ultimate arbiter of who actually got the story right here is our guest. So, like, is what we're saying sort of like what you would want the viewers to sort of understand about sort of how you came to be where you are today?
So I think that, Laura, with your analysis, you sort of jumped the gun. I did go through that process of realizing that transition wasn't really working that well only after I detransitioned. Like, it was totally uncharted. I mean, Vet is right in that my sort of, I mean, I guess both of you are right in different ways. I was having doubts along the way, but I didn't really know like what a doubt was actually. Like, I didn't have any awareness of what I was feeling the entire time. I was sort of just, I was ruled by my emotions while thinking I was ruled by just like the super robust logic and reason. And I was pretty good at, I guess, making split second decisions and throughout this like process. But I don't know. I think that I was unaware of my doubts as I was having them, but clearly they were there, and it's I started exploring them intellectually while still not understanding that they were my doubts. For like after the events of May of 2021, and then in the wake of October 7th, I was deeply traumatized. I was like, I was a wreck. I mean, I came back to the States maybe about a week after, and everything that I knew to be true about myself and my life had like just totally shattered. And I was extremely depressed. I mean, there were a couple of weeks there where I just couldn't get out of bed. I mean, I just witnessed the most horrifying things that I'd ever like. I didn't know that actually people could be this evil, that there was this much evil in the world. And so I came back to the States, and I was just I was really, really solemn. I was a shell of myself. Like, I'm not a depressive person. So I was shocked by the extent of my own really negative feelings. But then one day, of course, like, I had two cats at the time, and they both came downstairs, and they wanted someone to play with them. So they jumped up on the bed I was like bed rotting in, and eventually they left, and I just decided to follow them. And I feel like as I followed my cats around, the beginning of just like, okay, how do we cope with really immense grief? That sort of started. And I was really, I think, incapacitated by a cloud of grief for such a long time. I was like a pretty non-functioning person probably for the first 6 or 7 months after I, came back to the United States, and I'd begun my detransition, because that's sort of the promise I made to myself, if I survived the events of October 7th, that I was going to do that, because I realized, life is too short to live a lie that I now understand to be a lie. And so I sort of made that promise to myself based on a largely intellectual veneer. But I was still kind of not really dealing with any of the feelings related to it. I was just trying to shove them away. I was drinking a lot. It was not good. And so probably about 7 months into my detransition, I started going on podcasts and kind of talking about my story. And I don't really think I knew what I was getting myself into either. I was 24, and I'm going to be 27 in a week. So that's kind of insane. But I was really like, I was kind of reeling, but I was like, when I started going on the podcast, I got to a place where like I could go outside and I'd hear a car or like a motorcycle. And though I would have like a panicked response because it reminded me of like a siren or a rocket or something, I was able to kind of tune it out, or I'd put on headphones and I'd be like, okay, I'm not in Israel. This is just a car. This is just a motorcycle. So like I was kind of very slowly getting out of that process. And I originally sort of started my advocacy, and everyone dissuaded me from doing it. I mean, everyone was like, Maia, you've already wasted so much of your life on this gender stuff. You're so young. Don't do it. But, I am not the type of person who's easily dissuaded from doing things I want to do. And I, in particular, the reason that I thought that I might have something interesting to add to the gender conversation is because when I was first watching like gender critical discourse in the early 2020s, while I was still trans and like living as trans in that way, but kind of, I had a lot of questions, including a lot of questions that apparently lots of more like, it seems like Gen X and Boomers, whether they were old school transsexuals or not, were having these same doubts and concerns about the movement. And so, I mean, I was inspired by the work of Buck Angel, for example, and I was, listening to the stories of detransitioners. And actually, when I first started to encounter those stories, I became even more ardent in the supposition that I was like a true transsexual or whatever, because a lot of these girls would basically describe knowing that they had made a mistake because they wanted to like experiment with makeup and they wanted to wear leggings and they wanted to like be pretty, and they felt like they couldn't do that because they were trans. And that was obviously so far away from my own story that I was like, oh no, this means that I really need to go forward with a transition, because the people who are going to necessarily regret it are only the ones who are extremely gender conforming at a baseline. And I began to realize that actually this had not served me in those like 6 or 7 months. I was really reckoning with like everything. And I realized that there wasn't enough like representation of, just kind of like gender nonconformity that is like based in an understanding of one's sex as sort of just a fact that can be accepted and lived with. I didn't see enough, like, I didn't see any representation of those types of stories. And so I thought, it would be useful for, I want to be the type of voice that as a 12-year-old myself, I might have listened to. So,
like this, like I understand that you felt you had a unique spin on things that you weren't hearing represented out in the out in the space, and had something to add for anyone who might have experience close to yours. I want to come back to something you said earlier, because you talked about the role of trauma and sort of the focusing role of trauma in helping you come to a better understanding of yourself. And you talk about October 7th, which I'm Jewish as well. Obviously, a formative. Everybody remembers. Anybody who has any connection to Israel-Palestine remembers the impact of that day. I personally wasn't in Israel, but obviously know a lot of people in Israel. I know people who were personally affected. Thankfully, none of my close relatives or friends were lost in ever, but a lot of ones removed. And it really does give you a sense, I myself spent a lot of time really thinking more about sort of what it means to be Jewish or a supporter of Israel, and and think a lot about Jewish identity in the aftermath of that. In your case, you sort of say it helped you focus on gender identity, and which and you had said you had some doubts leading up to it, but this was like a sort of a focusing event. The other thing I often hear in detransition stories is often other focusing events of people who have doubts, whatever the reasons may be, and then something speaks to them, something focuses them. In your case, maybe October 7th. Other people, it's sort of religion, or rediscovering religion. And I know in, for instance, Chloe Cole's version of her detransition, this played a role. I said I don't want to go in depth of it. She's not our guest today, but this is something she's publicly stated. What was it about the trauma specifically that sort of said, as opposed to exploring other parts of identity or rededicating yourself to Zionism or something of that nature, why it became about gender?
So I think I think that part of it is a temperamental thing. Like, I think that I tend to process really complex emotions and kind of broader social and developmental themes through the lens of my special interest. Like the fact that I became really obsessed with this pituitary adenoma that causes gigantism and acromegaly when I was like 8 years old. Well, that's because, my mom was telling me that, I was hitting puberty and I was going through a growth spurt, and I was fundamentally confounded about the concept of growing up. And so I think that exploring it in a highly literal fashion gave me the ability to like kind of understand at a rudimentary level what it is to like physically kind of like grow up, And I think that when I was in Israel, my my kind of driving force when I was like living there, it was two parts, right? The first part obviously was trying to pass as a guy and seeing whether this is something I should do forever. Living the real life test. And the other part of it is that, of course, I was an Israeli-Palestinian peace activist. So that was my social group. That was my identity, my more primary identity than even, trans was. I thought of trans more as like something that I was doing rather than something per se that I was. I thought it was something I needed to do. But like my kind of main identity was as a member of this like peace group. And we had all sorts of really interesting adventures. We were like dodging military checkpoints. We were in areas of the West Bank that we were not legally allowed to be in, as Jews and as Israelis. And like it was, and I got to meet all sorts of oddballs. It was a peace group, and there were like, parents who'd bring their little kids there. And there were also people in their 70s and 80s who did events with this peace group. So, and everyone in between. And I think that, when October 7th happened, I think that my identity as a member of this peace group shattered, because a lot of the Palestinians in the peace group, well, not a lot, but there were a few who it became clear that like they had alternative motives for being in this peace group. They weren't actually that they wanted peace, because they were celebrating the attacks of October 7th. And these were close friends of mine. And they did it back in like May of 2021 a little bit. But I kept trying to explain it away with something, because I didn't understand that actually people could misrepresent their intentions. That's not something I understood. It made me very open, like very prone to manipulation. And so I would keep trying to find rationalizations to try to understand behavior that didn't make sense. But then on October 7th, it was just like some of us in this peace group were actually like supposed to be at the Nova Festival. Yeah. And so to see them then celebrating that, it was like
incredibly identity fracturing, like in a sense.
Yeah. Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
Like then, and I was, and most of my life over there, like I went from speaking a lot of English to speaking very little English. So, I was thinking more in other languages that I didn't have as many words in. And I think that also kind of slowed down my thought process. Like I had to think about myself and how to like, talk and kind of talk about what I was going through and just reflecting on my life. Like I was doing it in languages that I was actively learning. And so it was harder for me to just intellectualize it endlessly, because I had to figure out like simpler words that I actually knew for how to describe what was going on in my brain. And in a way, I think that was sort of grounding as well. So I think there was like also this kind of cognitive linguistic factor.
So it's kind of like, once you start thinking about, like, we talk about identity and your identity as a peace activist, like you're the peace poet, and then once this happens, it sort of gives you this foundation to examine a lot of different aspects of identity to see, if my identity as a peace activist isn't working for me and this really isn't who I am, are there other aspects of my identity that really are not serving a purpose in my life at this point?
Yeah, like that was part of it. And then there was also the part of it where I was sort of, when your life is thrown into absolute chaos and you're a young person who already very much struggles with executive function, whatever structure was holding your life together, because it isn't your executive function, it isn't your kind of general like life competency. It's whatever structure you manage to put in place, either a school structure or an identity structure, or a social structure. Those things are kind of what holds you together. And so, like, when I kind of reflect back on why October 7th was such a major turning point, or even why the rocket attacks in May of 2021 were such a kind of massive, like, that was the first catalyst that got me down the first rabbit hole that caused me to question a lot of this stuff, kind of divorced from myself at first, because I was still like 21, and I don't think I was like cognitively capable of divorcing my self-concept from my beliefs in any way. I mean, I think that maybe only at about this age, at almost 27, I'm beginning to be able to do that. So part of this is a cognitive kind of developmental process, but I think the other factor is simply that, and I think about the moment of my life where I was like, I had to make a split-second decision of, will I put on this breast binder so I can pass as a man in the bomb shelter, or will I make it to the bomb shelter in time? Like, I think the reason that kind of thought process occurred in that moment kind of reflecting on it then is because it's almost like I'd gotten myself deep into something and I had never really understood why, you know? Like I just thought this was a really good idea when I was 12 and I just kind of went with it. Like I'm super impulsive. And and like I was, and there were so many things about my experience in transition where like at least initially, I thought that I was absolutely making the right decision. But of course, once you live the real life test for a while, you start to realize that actually this is way harder than anyone had led you to believe.
Yeah,
Like
crazy.
it's way harder. And most things for me in my life, I had all these like kind of hopes and dreams, and I thought, I was really naive, and I thought if I can just get the Jews and Arabs to get along, like I speak both of their languages, I can understand when they're kind of, if they're communicating in English, where they're kind of mistranslating without understanding it. So maybe I can be a cultural liaison. Like I was trying to figure out what's my place in this movement, and and I really thought that peace was possible. Like I really genuinely believed it. And everyone was like, Maia, you're so naive, or well, they were calling me by a male name, but they were basically saying like, oh, you're so naive, like it's never gonna happen. Like, and I was just like, see, the problem, it's these Jews and these Arabs who are not in our peace group. They're the problem, But and they were all like, in their 40s and 50s, and they're like, when we were young, we were just like you. We were just like you. And guess what happened? We lived through X, Y, and Z terror attacks, and we realized we saw the truth. And I was like, no, there's no way. There's no way these old people are right about this. There's no way. I totally dismissed their opinions, and I was, I think that every young person sort of goes with this thing where they have like some kind of utopian fantasy about the world. Yeah, and it gets tested, and how they respond to that ends up being a kind of identity changing or shifting moment. And I think for me, a lot of having like finally entertaining my own doubts, even though I still would not have been able to put the word doubt to it, in the context of that, I mean, I think it was all it was bound up with like my broader trajectory of like, kind of adolescent and young adult identity formation.
So how was your process when you were starting to desist, your process of changing your forward-facing expression? Like, did you ever kind of say, let people know that you actually were female, or did you keep that male appearance in place in that context and then return to openly being female here in the States?
I'd confided a few of my thoughts and my doubts into some people, like a very, very few people within that peace group. And many of them were shocked that I was female in the first place. Like they really genuinely just thought that I looked young and that I was guy. And so that was like really, that was like, that was an experience. And then, but in terms of like, basically coming out and being like, oh, hey guys, like, I'm actually a woman. I didn't do that on a wide scale in Israel because part of it is because like I had just woven myself into this web and I didn't know how to get out of it, and I didn't want to lose the life that I had, basically, and my life was really engaging, and I had like so much freedom that your average woman in the Middle East is not going to have the type of freedom that I had pretending to be a man. Like, that's just the truth. I mean, even in terms of like, and I don't just mean in a gender sense, but like most people kind of don't get the freedom that I had because they're born with a certain passport, and so, or a certain identity document. And so there are areas they just can't go into, and they don't speak the four most commonly spoken languages in that country. Like the only people I knew who spoke all four languages that I spoke, which are English, Russian, Arabic, and Hebrew, they're immigrants from like the post-Soviet countries who are around my age, who are also kind of autistic and obsessed with languages. Those are the only people I knew who spoke that combination of four languages. And they also had like a similar level of freedom. And, and so I think that like I was over there, I really, the gender roles were so rigid that it gave me a lot of structure. Like from the moment,
it was pragmatic. almost.
I was extremely, like, I was and am like a pretty pragmatic person. I mean, when I went to the Western Wall for the first time, like, I did not know which side I was supposed to go on, because I had just come back from the West Bank where that one guy was like using masculine language for me, and he thought I was a guy, and I was like, wait, am I actually pulling this off here? Like, no one's doing this weird pronoun ritual of like, oh, let's please state your pronouns, and then calling me they, them, regardless of what I've said anyways. And so I was like, wait, so which side do I go on? And so I started to go towards the women's side, but then there was like a security guy there, and he presumably thought that I was like a lost tourist who was like a teenage boy that was not, figuring out where he was supposed to go. And so he pointed me to the men's side. He prevented me from entering the women's side. And then there were a couple women as well who kind of had this weird look on their face as I was like approaching the entrance to the Western Wall. And so I got pointed to the men's side, and I ended up on the men's side, and I actually got an impromptu bar mitzvah that I didn't know happened until it was like over, which was like insane. And so like, it really wasn't, I was constantly making calculations of which sector of the society I belonged in and where I was supposed to be based on, like, obviously I was speaking Hebrew and Arabic most of the time, so I could tell immediately what gender someone saw me as.
Yeah.
And like,
for those who didn't see our first episode, Hebrew and Arabic are both very strongly gendered languages that incorporate gender into like almost every noun and every verb. Like, so when you're speaking to a man or a woman, use totally different verbs, not just pronouns.
Yeah, exactly. And so like, I was basically, I was constantly making calculations about how is it best for me to go through this process without just like totally imploding my life, because I knew from the outset that like living a double life would be very challenging. Like, I did have enough self-awareness at probably 17 or 18 to kind of start to understand, like, as I was beginning to kind of put these steps into motion to kind of construct this new identity, I began to realize, wait a second, like, I'm going to have to be known by one name to some people and by another name to another people, to other groups of people. And I have to make sure that these people don't come into contact with each other, because that's going to screw up my entire plan. Like, I didn't ever really want to be known as trans. I really, really wanted to be normal. Like, I would rather have, even in the height of my like kind of cross-sex ideations, I would have much rather that someone just, saw that I was female and call me she than, to call me they, them, because that they, them is like a really alienating, kind of like isolating, sort of term, at least as I saw it then. I was really averse to it. And so I was constantly kind of making these various calculations. And I just thought, like, how in the world am I going to tell all these like Orthodox Jewish guys that I've befriended and that we've given handshakes to each other and high fives, that they've been handshaking and high fiving a woman this entire time? Like, that's going to be really awkward for them. And then with my Palestinian friends in the West Bank, like, the repercussions of that could be even worse. So I was just, I was just thinking, like, this is...
So Israel's not going to be a place where you could desist and say, so coming back to the States gives you an opportunity to sort of like, I can now leave this part behind that's sort of geographically locate, that identity almost is tied to geography. I can leave that geography behind. I can come back to my native geography, and along with it, potentially explore the transition back to a more recognizable native gender role.
Yeah, sort of. But like, I didn't have this whole plan about it either. I was sort of going one step at a time.
Yeah.
I was really still like very much incapable of thinking through what this is going to look like down the line, right? Like, because I thought, like, what actually would it even look like for me to live as a woman? Like, I'd never done it before. So I didn't, I got this idea in my mind when I was a little kid, and I never presumed that I would grow up to be a woman. Like, that development kind of didn't happen. Like, as soon as I attained the understanding of sex constancy, I was already kind of really ambivalent about it and trying to find my way out. And then I latched onto this explanation, and it gave me a way to sort of be able to maintain the type of freedom and lifestyle that I wanted to. And then, of course, when I started to have like, attraction to girls, and I started to realize what that was, I was like, okay, so this makes even more sense that I have a male brain and a female body, right? And so I just kept every like bit of my subsequent development from the age of 12 onward, they were all like kind of pebbles, and I would just toss them in the trans bucket. I would be like, okay, this is evidence for why I'm trans and like why I need to do this and why I have a male brain or whatever. And I just kept throwing stuff into that bucket. And I never touched it. As soon as I took that pebble and threw it into the metaphorical bucket, I didn't go back into the bucket and examine any of it until after I had made the choice to detransition. And so I sort of like, at that point, I was like, wait, so like, what am I supposed to do? Right? Because it's not like I wanted to, it's not like my life in transition was just such a huge departure from how I am now. Like, I didn't have to put on this new persona. I didn't really have to change how I walked or how I talked or anything. I just kind of existed.
Yeah. Yeah. Stop binding and things of like that, more physical things.
Yeah, more physical things. Because like, I'm very atypical as a woman anyways. And like, there are like very legitimate reasons that I came to believe, I guess, that I had a male brain and a female body. And the reason obviously is mostly autism. And, the fact that autism is often thought of as having like the extreme male brain when you're thinking about males who have it. And females who have it tend to have certain character qualities that are more masculine than like average females. So I was still trying to figure out like, well, wait a second. So if I'm not really a man, if I'm not really meant to be a man or to live as a man, like why am I so odd as a woman? Like nothing is changing the fact that I'm a very, very atypical member of my sex. And I needed to know an answer. And, so it kind of started from there. So then I came back to the United States and I stopped binding, and it was a very gradual process of like, when I had given up on passing as a man, when there was not that external goal that was very like literal and I could measure it, I could measure how close I was to the goal by hearing how these people who were speaking gendered languages were speaking about me. When I'd given up on that kind of external goal of kind of controlling how other people perceived me, I went back to my baseline of actually not caring at all about my appearance or my body or even my health. I totally let myself go. I drank a lot. I tried to numb my really, negative feelings with like food, alcohol. I was in an extremely bad place. And, and I didn't feel really much better in my body at all. And then of course after I'd stopped binding, I sort of assumed, that like my body and my life would kind of go back to normal. I mean, when I sort of was reflecting on this with some detransitioners who I'd befriended online and at some events before I even came out with my advocacy, they were like there was a lot of this talk like, oh, Maya, you're so lucky you got out of this like without harming your body. And I really believed that I'd gotten out of this without harming my body. But my body was still like in so much pain. And I, at some point, like I had read up on like, breast binding and like, and I'd found myself in forums where sort of that was being discussed. And I began to realize that like all of this like kind of increasingly crippling pain that I was in, throughout like my adolescence and my early adulthood, like pain in my shoulders, my neck, my back, my ribs, things like that. I had thought that was actually kind of just normal and probably a result of like being born prematurely. Like I didn't understand that it was the result of that.
So are you saying that this sort of recognition, if you talked about this with the detransitioners, we've had other detransitioners on the show, probably most recently we had Johnny Skinner on, and we sort of talk about this, going from, the sense of as you start to understand yourself and re-identifying, or whether you identify as a detransitioner or identify back in your gender role, to when does this just become my personal journey? And when does it translate into advocacy? And when does that advocacy come to being, well, I want to share my story because there might be other people like me who are experiencing similar symptoms, having similar complications, having similar life trajectories, who I don't want to further damage themselves, or I want to show that there's another way. I think there's obviously a lot of value to those kind of stories, and anyone who's transitioned, and obviously with detransition, values hearing about people who are having experiences similar to theirs and what their trajectories are. The reason why I transitioned is ultimately because I heard stories that resonated with me about people who had stories similar to my life as a male, who are now living what appeared to be successful lives as women. That was my motivation. Those stories were very important to me. And so I understand the motivation is detransition, even if the valence is the opposite of getting the stories out there. At what point, though, does it become sort of more of a broad advocacy to more like, I'm just a storyteller and I want people to know about my experience, to I want to make sure that other people generally don't get harmed by what I went through?
I think that it's I can't speak for everyone. Obviously, I can only speak for kind of my own process and sort of like a cohort of girls that is very, very similar to me. Like once I had taken like the gender presentation element out of it and stopped focusing on like, oh, well, the reason it didn't work for these girls is because actually they're girly girls and they're heterosexual. And, they are, of course, going to be bad candidates for this type of thing. Like, why would they even want to do it? That was my thinking. And it was very immature when I was like, in my, like when I was like 21, 22, maybe even 23. And, so there was that bit of like kind of, that was the axis or the kind of the axis upon which I was analyzing this type of stuff. But then when I stripped away the gender presentation element of it, and I was talking to some of my detrans friends, and I would try to pick their brain about things because this is not all these like gender topics. It's not like I had really discussed them at length with anyone really. Like I didn't stay squarely in any one community. I've never really been the type of person who sort of has like some close friends that sort of have stayed with me throughout my life. I sort of just jump around from one special interest to the next, make friends there. And then, I don't really know how to sustain those friendships when either my interest or this other person's interest, like special interest, has changed. And so that's just kind of like a factor, like a feature of my personality. And so I was contending with that as well. But I was talking with some of my other friends and they were all like, Maia, you are extremely autistic. Has like anyone told you this? And I was like a total autism denialist for a while. I mean, I was obsessed with autism when I was like, starting from like 11 to 13 or 14, but more about the neuroscience angle. Like I definitely, and I thought like, oh, well, there's no way that I could be autistic. I mean, I was evaluated for ADHD. There's so much symptom overlap. This is the label that explains like my oddness. And then some of my friends were like, Maia, you were literally a toe walker as a toddler. Like you were a toe walker. You were reading medical journals when you were 8. You couldn't tie your shoes until you were like almost 15. You're super autistic. And and I was really averse to that. I think for some reason, to accepting that for quite a while. And like, but then eventually I realized like, wait a second, because then some of these other detransitioners that were telling me that, I would listen to some of their interviews and they would talk about their own autistic traits. And most of them objectively had like a kind of a much more mild presentation. And when I started to think about it in that way, I was like, oh, wait, this is the commonality. It actually matters significantly less, like whether this person kind of at their core, at least with the girls, I'm going to say, like, at least with the girls, I can't speak for the boys, but at least what I've noticed with the girls is that it's like the gender issues are much less about gender literally and are much more about gender symbolically or metaphorically. And the kind of common factor with at least some subsection of the girls is autism. And so I sort of began to think about it kind of more so in that way. And I kind of realized like, maybe I do have a more kind of odd presentation or maybe a more moderate to severe presentation than what most of these girls who could stumble across my videos have. And maybe they're on the precipice of making a bigger, a bigger decision. Like maybe they've socially transitioned and they're, contemplating hormones, or they're on hormones and they're contemplating surgeries, and they might be having some doubts. And so they actually come across it and they engage with it kind of like how I did. and they don't realize that what they're having are doubts. Like maybe they'll come across these videos and they'll think, well, actually, wait a second. What if I did just think myself into this really like kind of grandiose thought experiment instead of actually engaging in my identity development in like a kind of a typical way that's embodied? Like, what if I've just thought myself, what if I've just also like, just like this person, been living my life in a thought experiment and I haven't tried the other way? So, I mean, that was kind of like my goal as I saw it. Like it kind of evolved a little bit, like as I went along.
So I've noticed recently you've been posting, like on X, quite a bit about this embodiment playing out, about taking your health seriously and becoming active. And you have a lot of photographs of yourself skating, and very obviously female. You know, like you're not hiding your breasts at all. So tell me about that process and like what has triggered it and what is it bringing you?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it's from a pragmatic standpoint, impossible to, without causing yourself a lot of damage, it's impossible to hide like comically large breasts on a 5 foot tall frame. So, I mean, that I don't have as much control over, but, so that's not something that I'm like doing to make a statement. It's just something I'm doing because like I don't want to harm myself anymore. There's no real goal other than to, kind of, I guess, like have the right gear so that I am not creating a ton of drag when I'm skating, or, obviously with a nerve injury to my back, like I have to figure out like which types of bras to wear now, and most things I can't wear. I mean, the area is so disfigured that most undergarments are kind of out of the question. And so that's been, kind of part of the acceptance for me is, and kind of coming to terms with my female body is like not just coming to terms with the fact that I have a female body. It's also coming to terms with the fact that I'm not just a floating brain living in a thought experiment. Like, I think that someone like myself,
that's very autistic. I've heard this. I hadn't really thought about it before. It's been mentioned a few times. I've seen about autistic people almost having this like, what if I could live without a body? Wouldn't that be great? And like most people don't think like that. Like I like having a body. I think it's really cool. I like dressing it up. I like I like how it looks. And and I'm not saying this unique to autistic people, but there was this thread going on about how it's very common among autistic people to be like, that would actually be a preferred state, to actually just be a brain in a vat and not worry about sort of the corporeal limitations of having a body in this world. Where I'm kind of like, whoa, that's kind of strange. Like I can understand the appeal of being a brain in the vat in the sense like if your body didn't work, or if you didn't have the choice of having a body, but it would be a definite like third or fourth choice over like having a body, and particularly having a body that works for you. So you just sort of mentioned that as an aside, and even like as you're talking about having your words not mine, comically large breasts on a small frame, of just kind of like, well, this of like almost being a reality acceptance of, well, this is my body, this is who I am, these things are, I'm going to take them everywhere I go, and so I might as well just find a way to be able to do the things I love doing in this body.
Yeah, exactly. Like, because I think that's actually, I think you've summarized my sort of position, and like, as up until this point, and who knows like how else I'll change. I think, I think I've changed a lot, like even over the course of the last like year. I think, I don't know if it's an age thing. I don't know, like, but I still feel like the like when you think about like adolescence, and Laura, you have 2 or 3 adolescents yourself, and they change so much, like on a sort of even monthly basis. Like they cycle through so many different phases and thought processes and hobbies and things like that. And I think that for me, like at this stage in my life, rather than that being like an every month thing, it seems almost like every maybe 2 to 3 months, I'll come to a new conclusion where I've totally kind of debunked something that I thought was very true even a couple months ago. So it's slowed down slightly, but I feel like that rapid development is still like it's slowing down, but it's still like going on. So I don't know how else I'm going to change. I can't predict that. I have enough awareness to understand that I might though at this age. Whereas when I was even a year or two younger, certainly 3 or 4 years younger, I basically thought that I'd had life figured out. It seems like every young person has a bit of hubris in this regard, and especially someone who relies on basically highly robust intellect to parse that which eludes them intuitively. And so, yeah, I think that's sort of my stance up until this point. But there's also the whole, to go back to like the baseline level of disembodiment that a lot of autistic people experience. I think that, I've tried to theorize about why this is, because like one of the things that was most compelling to me in the way that trans people in their mid to late 20s that I was watching when I was 12, the way they told their stories, particularly some of these FTMs, and some of them have since detransitioned and some haven't. And some of them have just kind of gone AWOL. Like, I don't know what happened to them. But like one of the things I just kind of remember hearing, and these would have been videos that were probably shot in like 2009 or 2010. And I was watching them in like 2011 and 2012. That they were discussing was this feeling of like looking into the mirror from a young age and just not really connecting the idea that was them staring back in the mirror. And they kind of rationalized this as a trans thought. And of course, I had always, I had always, even as a very young kid, remember like whenever at school, for example, I'd wash my hands and there was a mirror, like I'd stand on the stepping stool and so I could actually kind of see like my shoulders up and see my face, and to wash my hands. I just remember every single day thinking like, wait, what? That's me? And it wasn't even like an explicitly gender distress thought. It was just like this confusion almost about like object permanence that most people get over by the time they're 2, and I just kind of lived with that. And even to this day, I still kind of experience that actually, and I experienced it throughout transition, but I just kind of know what to expect now. I know that when I look in the mirror, I'm going to see my reflection and that is how I look. Like I've prepared myself for it cognitively, and it surprises me less. But like that is something that I thought about kind of when you made your reflections.
Yeah. So I know, Vet and I were one of the things we really wanted to get into today. And one of the things I probably should caution both you and our guests about, and maybe I'll give you the option here, is Vet has to leave in about 10 minutes. And we're having a great conversation. I'm happy to continue it with just the two of us, or have you come back again. And maybe I'll try to coordinate out if it's better that time. So do you have a preference on how?
Oh, I think it would be, well, maybe what if for the last like 10 minutes that Yvette could still be here, like what if she reflects on some of the things and then like I'll zip my mouth and then maybe the two of us can continue, or I guess it really just depends on like how you guys want to do this, because I do think
I'm open to anything. Like I know we've already had to come back. Like this part I'll cut a little bit. I've already had to come back twice. I mean once for the second time, and I do want to get the episodes out, and we have to wait like another month for the third one, and then it's going to be like sitting on the shelf for a long time. Or because we did, I know I promised I'd cut you off better, but I get into your conversations too, and I don't want to cut you off because I too wonder where they're going to go, and we, I really want to talk about the advocacy. I really want to talk about the autism and its role about detransition and all, and those kind of things that we led to. But if we don't, we don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they're kind of getting threaded together rather than being in separate segments.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, I've really been fascinated about that. One of the thoughts that has kept crossing my mind is when you were talking about part of your motivation to tell your story and to be public is that we really don't see very many gender nonconforming women, and publicly at least. And it made me think about the fact that by the time you were 12 years old, the lesbian community had already been cleared. And so there were fewer women coming forward, obviously gender nonconforming, very comfortable in their bodies. They've navigated this. And, I'm gender conforming in some ways and non-conforming in others. I found great power in that. But I had the opportunity to hang out and spend time with people like that. And it really doesn't exist anymore, because all those spaces have been queered. And so it's not just women, and it's, people who aren't lesbian calling themselves lesbian, yeah, I think there's been a great loss, and we need those faces out there, including yours.
Thank you. I mean, on a personal level, I appreciate that, and I also agree that like there aren't really like kind of, when I have most of my friends are like in their 40s and 50s, and so when I talk to them and they talk about their 20s, they will talk about, like, I have this one friend on the internet who said, like, when I was your age, I was like in bars, like doing like shots off of some like hot girl's like midsection or whatever, stomach, and I was just like, whoa, that just seems like an alternate universe. Like, how is that not a thing anymore? Like, no one, I mean, Zoomers kind of don't really leave the house that much. Like, we're sort of, most of us work remotely. We sort of like, we don't have like the means to just go out and party and drink all the time. And we don't really meet each other that much in person, unless like you manage to work at a job that's not remote, or you're in school or something. But most of the time you're in school, in the United States at least, you're not legally allowed to drink. So there's no like real outlet. And I think that there's probably a larger cultural shift beyond that as to like why, like lesbian communities, I think, assimilated really well. Because I guess they tend to be like more monogamous than gay men, like significantly.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think gay men have their own kind of like subculture, and lesbians sort of just kind of more so like coexist within the broader society. Not to say that gay men don't, but gay men who do coexist within the broader society also have like kind of their own subcultures that are still pretty robust, whereas lesbians don't. And that's like, the lesbian identity is like it's not a culturally popular one anymore. I think it's mostly just been reduced to like a category on like a pornography. Like it seems like everyone associates it with that, at least like a lot of Zoomers do. And so that's why, they'll call themselves like sapphic or something like that, because they just don't like the word.
Right. And, it's being queered, what I'm calling, and I'm referring to queer theory when I say that. Now that it's queered, it is not women who are exclusively same-sex attracted, hanging out together, wearing, their leather vest and playing pool. We very much had a strong subculture. But as we became kind and inclusive, the shadow, there were good sides of that, but the shadow of that is that lesbian culture became destroyed. I don't know of one women's bar anywhere. I mean, not that bars are the measure of, life and success.
There's a lot of different reasons, like a lot of bars don't exist anymore because
but
we spend time here.
We have a men's bar here, but not a women's bar. And then our gay bar is now queer. And Dyke Night includes anyone who identifies as a lesbian and their allies. So that's not Dyke Night. That's like going to a Mexican restaurant and, and bringing all your white friends. And nobody speaks Spanish, and, the menu's in English.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very different world from the one that older generations describe. So, I mean, I really wish that spaces like that did exist. Like, I think maybe this is just wishful thinking, because, I literally have this alien on my wall. I don't know if you guys see it.
Yep.
Yeah,
so
that's pretty apparent.
Yeah. I made sure to plug it in. That's partially why I was late to this call, is because I was like, oh no, I didn't plug the alien in. And so then I had to find the plug, and then I had to plug the alien in. Because the alien is sort of a part of my self-concept in a way. Like, in every single subculture I've ever been in, where I think, okay, I have something in common with some of these people. I also pretty quickly realize that I'm very different from them in pretty key ways that cause like social friction. So, and maybe it's just wishful thinking on my part to think that, oh yeah, like if there was a lesbian community, it would be so easy to find a girlfriend. And
we had plenty of autistic women in the lesbian community. They were not shunned for that.
Really?
Yeah. Like at Michigan, for sure. I can name several. I mean, I won't because, I don't have their permission. But yeah, I mean, they still had difficulties reading social cues and blah, blah, blah. But they were totally accepted. They did have girlfriends, maybe not as often as they wanted, but, they weren't.
I just find like women in general are less tolerant of autistic behaviors than other women than men are of autistic behaviors than other men. Just in terms of like what people are looking for, like what men are looking for in friends and what women are looking for in friends. I actually read a really interesting piece about this.
I gotta go.
I don't know if it's Helen Pluckrose or one of those types of
right.
Movies. Yeah, but anyways, it's I have little to add on to what lesbian communities were like back then because I've never been part of one, but it's interesting.
Right. So It was great talking to you today, Maia, and whether y'all finish this or there's a part 3, it's all going to be good. So thanks for chatting. And I have to head out.
That has a real life.
I know.
Thank you, Yvette.
It's dark if you ask me.
It was really good to talk to you, Yvette, as well. I think we should just keep. I think it's really important to just keep having these types of conversations because what you said just honestly shocked me. Like, wait, so there have like always been women like me. They've always been there. Like, I'm like now a little bit angry that no one had told me that sooner. Like, what the hell? I just like went on this entire like messed up chase towards certain self-destruction, and I didn't have like very basic knowledge about the full scope of my options. It's like, oh, it just sucks. But yeah.
Yeah, at 26, I didn't either. I mean, I was a little older. I was in my 30s when I joined that. But I've got to go, so I'm not late. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Laura.
Bye, Beth. Yes. So, for those of you who are still with us, you're probably noticing that we've moved from 3 down to 2. Yvette, as it turns out, has real life outside of this podcast and had to get back to it. I don't, or at least I've put my real life back off to a few more hours, which gives me an opportunity to talk to Maia, and we sort of discuss whether we want to bring her back for a 3rd time, or whether we ought to just continue some of this important conversation with just the 2 of us. And what we decided to do was just carry on with the 2 of us, with the goal of really wanting to cover some of what I think are really the key issues that we wanted to get to today, rather than leaving the audience hanging about that. And while Yvette isn't here, I'm going to try to do my best at not just giving like the trans-supporting side of the arguments when I can, and then afterwards, after Yvette has a chance to watch it, maybe she'll give us some of her reflections as well. So, sorry audience, I know you've probably gotten used to having both me and Yvette here, but I think this conversation is really important to have, and Maia's agreed to be part of it. Yes, the nod constitutes agreement.
I thought that you were doing like a little intro transition, but like, yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I think it'd be interesting. Yeah, let's continue with the conversation.
Let's do it. I just want to it's almost like I'm asking consent here before we go along. We're getting positive consent from you, Maia.
Yeah.
Okay. So, one of the things, like I said, I really want to get into, we spent a lot of time talking about your autism and your recognition of autism and how autism has shaped your, even if you didn't always, maybe didn't realize at the time, shaped your gender journey and your detransition journey and continues to have an impact on how you see the world. What I really want to focus on is that one of the things you talked about just before was that when you talk to detransitioners, you find autistic behaviors, autistic traits, or diagnoses of autism in a lot of detransitioners, especially among the natal female transitioners, who I'm guessing you spend most of your time with. And we also knew, or have come to recognize, that autism is a common cofactor in people who seek out transition It seems to be especially common among natal females who seek out transition, or at least overrepresented to where autistic traits are among females in general, because autistic traits are more common in males in general. But the other interesting part of it, and I've spoken about this with Kinnan McKinnon, who is a detransition scholar who we've had on this program before, is that autistic histories or autistic traits seem to be even overrepresented among the detransition cohort. So not only is it drive people to transition, but it seems, especially in women, maybe even more likely to prompt a detransition. And not necessarily a regretful detransition, but just some form of desistance detransition. So what do you think of it? I know you really talk about autism longs, but what, from a practical perspective, I'm looking at this from a clinician's perspective, recognizing that autism is present, what are the types of ways that clinicians, whether they be physicians, therapists, other support workers, should be engaging with a person's history of autism, a person's perception, my perception of the clinician, that you're demonstrating autistic type behaviors, when guiding someone on any step of a gender journey, whether that is starting transition, supporting transition, or starting to deal with doubt and detransition?
That's a really good question. And I wish it were a question that people were asking more, because there's a tendency in this highly polarized topic for people to basically to stay on the surface level and to just kind of resort to a bunch of ideological talking points. And one of the common ones is in trans activist circles, not in all of them, but in the pretty predominant super loud ones, that is basically oh yeah, there are no co-occurring disabilities or mental illnesses that should change anything about the way this person is treated, and that's really irresponsible in my opinion.
And I'd also say it's irresponsible the other way too. Just to,
and I was going to get to that. I was going to get to them too. And on the gender critical side, right? There is a lot of the same kind of surface level kind of thinking where it's oh, they're castrating and maiming and mutilating autistic kids, and it's okay, that you haven't suggested an alternative though, because these kids, and it goes beyond just autism, right? The fact remains, and I've noticed this on parenting forums, both on the gender critical ones and on the more pro-trans ones, that parents of autistic kids, including of very young kids, but sometimes even teenagers and young adult kids, they're kind of, it's all parents, just asking for advice, and their kids could be of any number of ages. And it's clear to me that on both camps, even in terms of parents who are looking for advice, there's basically no one's really giving great autism informed advice. There is, there was I remember reading this one post about this parent saying that their child was kind of on the cusp of puberty and had not clearly articulated how they felt about it, or this parent was, I presume, a mom. I think this person was a mom, was basically saying oh yeah, my trans daughter is on the cusp of puberty, and we don't know what to do with a puberty blocker. Our kid is maybe more non-binary, or we don't, our kid doesn't seem to have dysphoria about their male body, but also likes to present femininely, but also doesn't think about this stuff, and we can't have a conversation about it. I haven't been able to figure out how to get this kid to actually be somewhat verbal. And when we're dealing with questions of fertility, and this kid doesn't even have a very clear preference, what do we do? And all these other parents are just saying, oh, just put your kid on puberty blockers because it'll buy them time. And it's what? That's also a very consequential intervention. So and then in the kind of the ROGD parenting forums, I'm seeing a lot of the same sort of, oh yeah, your kid has just been swallowed by a colt, and they're just a lemming, and very little of the advice given to parents of any persuasion. And I think that the advice for how to help autistic kids through this type of stuff, in an exploratory way, it should be divorced from any ideological leaning. That's what these kids deserve. They deserve autism informed kind of counseling and family-based interventions. And usually what I think this could look like in my like kind of ideal world, it would be that, that there would be basically a stream of clinicians who truly took like an exploratory approach, and they did a really thorough evaluation of the kid and of the family and got a super thorough development, like a developmental history. Because I think that it's important for clinicians that sometimes you're going to have to put the puzzle pieces together yourselves.
Yeah.
Because autistic traits, especially in girls, can present so differently than what you might be used to seeing. And a lot of these kids are so intellectually kind of ahead of their years, but emotionally, they are really very behind.
Yeah.
And they've come up with these really elaborate workarounds because of their high IQs to make it seem like they understand what it is they're talking about, when actually they could be very confused about very basic aspects of reality. And so the only way to like figure out whether this kid has an understanding of what they're saying or what they're thinking, part of developing that broader picture and to like help that person explore these things properly means that you kind of have to figure out, you have to be able to
you have to create a clinical structure for it, which currently doesn't exist, or if it does exist, it's sort of in very spotty ways being done by individuals as opposed to sort of guideline-based care. But like, there's a couple things that are really important that I think are important to summarize, which is that there's often a lot of very simplistic assumptions about autism, either that it's completely irrelevant or that it robs people of their agency and their ability to make, you use the word lemming, which I think is actually very apt, that like people assume that once you're autistic, you're incapable of making your own decisions because they're all going to be poisoned by your autism, which I think is harsh thinking, when really what people need, or the way I've often thought about it, is autism is a complexifying factor. It doesn't mean you're not trans, it doesn't mean you are trans, it just means that if you are going to undertake a transition, it might complicate your understanding of what's motivating you, and it might complicate the actual praxis of transition. Because when I think of transition, it's not just following a cookbook or following like instructions like how to put together, here's how to be female, like as if you're putting together like an IKEA kitchen unit. It's not just a follow the dots. It really involves a lot of observation, a lot of nonverbal communication, the ability to pick up on cues that really separate what it is to be male or female. And if you struggle to pick those kind of things up, or you think you're going to be able to read about them in a book and just be able to do them, you are going to find yourself adrift without the proper counseling who can say, you probably don't realize what you're not picking up on here. So it's not something to be ignored, but we have to recognize that it makes it complex. And if you don't take into account this complexity, you are setting up people for disappointment and for failure. And whether that is failure in the form of this is someone who probably shouldn't have transitioned in the first place because they really didn't understand their motivations and there were probably other less consequential ways of managing it, or that this is someone who potentially could have a positive transition journey, but they end up in rabbit holes, they end up in tangents, or they end up in dead ends because someone has not provided them the guidance to recognize where they're making their mistakes. And they end up detransitioning inappropriately, or not inappropriately, but detransitioning when the real problem was a failure to navigate that gender role because you lack the skills to do that because of your autism. Those are all things that we just aren't doing well right now, or at least I have the sense that we aren't doing that well in terms of organized practice.
Yeah, I think that by now, like my opinion is that gender medicine as a field, like if the practitioners of it, decide to kind of pull their heads out of their backsides and realize that they've been fumbling the ball pretty catastrophically for quite a while, and in terms of just nixing any kind of differential diagnosis and considering it to be some form of bigotry, which is just like absurd. To me, like what really stood out is when I was like looking through this WPATH files and I saw that there was this one clinician who was discussing so we have this autistic kid who's basically nonverbal, and how do we get them to express their gender? Do we get them to draw their gender? And it's just like, wait a second. So this kid is basically nonverbal and they're distressed, right? And your first concern is to try to spend hours with them, trying to get them to like figure out how to draw their gender, rather than to be like, okay, mom and dad, I'm going to refer you to like a speech therapist so that your kid can like get those skills.
Yeah.
Because like, a lot of these kids, and that's a more severe presentation than most of these kids will have, but even in more milder forms of autism, more kind of mild to moderate, like there's, even if someone comes across as being highly intelligent, like if they have the deficit, they have the deficit. The people with like maybe higher IQs are probably better at making it seem like they don't have a social communication
or developing workarounds that,
yeah,
but
yeah,
because they're intelligent and they can develop systems, but it's not a substitute for being able to for the nonverbal communication. That's really a major part of forming friendships or forming relationships or establishing yourself as a legible member of another gender class,
or reconciling as a weird member of your own gender class. Because I think that, like, what I wish that a lot, I think that a lot of young autistic people, in particular, like teenagers and young adults, they when they're dealing with this gender stuff, they sort of have a tendency to see everything that is different about like them versus other people of their same sex class, and they
as
don't
a sign really of the other gender.
Yeah, as like a literal sign that they need to be the other one, and they kind of abide by that, and no one really seems to challenge their thinking, because like what autistic people need, I think, or what they crave deeply, is to be like actually properly understood, and a lot of times.
Now, are you talking about like fitting in or finding community, or something that's more?
I think that, I don't know. For me, I was not. I guess when I was maybe a teenager, I was actually kind of less concerned with finding community. I would still very much. I'm an extrovert, so this might sound paradoxical, but I would just kind of jump around between different friend groups, and I'd kind of, I would be amicable with everyone. But in terms of like anything resembling a sort of deeper kind of friendship where you talk about your thoughts and your feelings, and
you intuit what the other person is feeling and you respond to things. Yeah.
Like that sort of. I don't think I started to enter that element of my development probably for the first time, like until I was 16. Like I didn't have really close friends before then. I didn't feel lonely. I was actually quite popular at school because I was kind of I would jump around to these different social groups and just kind of energize people. But I'd mostly just talk to the adults. It was very hard for me to talk to kids my own age. I didn't really, once I realized that they didn't like hearing about the rare brain tumor I was fixated on, I kind of just didn't know what to talk with them about.
Yeah, no, but I understand where you're going here. Is that like one of the things that I think we both agree on, at least when it comes to clinically and how we manage people who are gender distressed, is that the goal shouldn't be how do we transition people, and the goal shouldn't be how do we prevent all transitions in all cases. It is, if you are a gender distressed young person, what is the best way to maximize the likelihood of making you a flourishing adult?
Yeah.
And I use the word flourishing pretty intentionally. I try to stay away from happiness because people say, well, happiness, well, you just take some heroin, you'll be happy, or take some coke, you'll be happy. But it's really about flourishing. It's about human flourishing, and what are and for some people who are gender distressed, their likelihood of flourishing is going to be better. Maintaining the body and avoiding medicalization for those kind of for that person. And then there's other people where I do truly think that if I'm talking about myself, and you're right, like I had a lot of personality traits that I thought this would be, the fact that I'm a woman makes it a much better fit for these types of personality traits or these types of modes of expression. And that's all true. But underlying that was a deep drive to be female. It wasn't just I want to be a woman because it'll help me express my emotions better, or it'll help me wear certain kinds of clothes in places that I can't wear them now. It was I really need to be this person. And that's sort of also a fundamental difference between, I think, the kind of people who persist with the transition and those who are using it more as a strategy to be like, how do I fit in better? To desist?
What do you mean when you say that, like, in addition to thinking like being a woman would work for me because I have certain character traits, or I could wear these like, clothes and that I want to wear like in all settings or more settings in my life, if I could like get other people to see me as a woman. And the other piece of it you said was this deep drive to be a woman. Can you explain
Yeah, like I think it's different for natal males and natal females, like on balance, like obviously with
Yeah.
perhaps some overlap. But like like I said, I don't want to spend the show psychoanalyzing myself so much, but it's really whatever. From a young age, I just developed this very strong curiosity about femalehood and female beings, and this idea of this just seems like a better way of being. And it wasn't, and a lot of these other things got layered onto it as far as the social aspects. Like, and it just so happened my personality was such that when I did decide to transition, I think it made my transition more successful because I wasn't fighting against a lot of personality traits that maybe were more naturally masculine. But it was much more of a deeper drive that was more primary, I think, than when I'm hearing detransitioner stories today. I hear a lot of this, and I've talked about this with other therapists about it being sort of a strategy. I feel this way if I were a boy. I wouldn't have these problems that I have trying to fit in as a girl, or as you now come to understand, as an atypical member of your sex class. Maybe it's easier to be a more typical member of the other sex class, even though my chromosomes and body doesn't match, and I'm going to need medicines to make that work, than to be an atypical member of my own sex class.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm still not sure I totally understand this more, like what you're discussing in terms of this more primal drive. It might actually just be like a sex difference, because like I think that yeah, like I think that transition it's a strategy in all cases. Like I don't think that it's only a strategy in some cases. I think it's a strategy for managing gender distress in all cases. And there are some people for whom like they're more aware of their motivations and their goals, and maybe they're more mature, or they're like kind of like cognitively speaking more mature and more able to actually do some analysis of like, what will this actually take? What of my life now will I kind of have to bulldoze, and like how do I try to like have this implode my life less? Because it's a very, especially initially, it is very destabilizing. Like, cause especially if you want to be kind of stealth, you sort of have to you just sort of have to find yourself in like a totally different location. I mean,
there's incredible sacrifice stuff being made.
Yeah.
Like there's no question about it. Like I'm saying, every transition involves some degree of sacrifice, from the very basics of I'm sacrificing my fertility, I'm sacrificing my place in society, I'm sacrificing not being on medications, but you're doing it with the hope of some payout down the road. And obviously have the fact that I've been able to achieve most of the payout has made, in my case, this is obviously a very worthwhile endeavor. And I think many trans people would say the same thing, even if they don't have many outward signs of success. But like I said, I know we can talk about you and I all day. What I really want to focus on are the specific issues here around autism, which I think we sort of covered to some extent about how we would like to see clinical care. The other part of that you bring up, which is really important, is about exploration. How like probably anyone who's considering a transition benefits from some period of exploration. I think people with autistic traits probably benefit even more. One of the challenges we also have in the current environment, and this is, is that exploration, the line between exploration and conversion is fairly fine. In terms of, are we exploring with the goal of getting you to desist specifically, or are we exploring in the hopes that you might desist, because that might actually be the best path for you? How do you think, how can we do this in a way that's more explicit to say that either what we're doing is not conversion therapy, or even maybe what we're doing is conversion therapy and that's a good thing?
I think that, the way I think about it is that like the ideal outcome for someone, in my opinion, is to like, if they're able to live a good life without transition, I think that outcome should be encouraged.
Sure.
Yeah. Like that's just like my very kind of like unabashed stance. I think that it's a really like kind of psychosocially and physically invasive process. And the younger you are, the less capable you are of understanding that as well. And the more autistic you are, and the younger you are, as two factors, the less capable you are of understanding that. And so I think that, like, in my opinion, we basically, I think the goal of this therapy, well, I don't think that it should just be one therapist actually. Like I think that
Yeah, I'm
talk
talking about
therapy is
therapy
honestly
broadly, like
over.
the
I think that
program.
talk therapy, like I would like to see a totally different model actually. I think that talk therapy is honestly largely overrated. A lot of talk therapists are not good. I've been to so many therapists throughout the course of my life who've just been patently incompetent. They thought they knew what was going on with me. And so they basically just injected thoughts into my mind as like a 7-year old, right? Like when I was pulling out all my eyelashes, because I was like overwhelmed by everything kind of like socially and sensorially. And as soon as my toe walking was corrected and I was in leg braces and I couldn't deal with the annoyance of having my heels touch the ground. I would walk on my toes, and when I couldn't do that anymore,
But I think what
I'd,
you're illustrating here
like
is really
pull out.
some of the challenges of therapy, which is that
Yeah,
therapy is very heterogeneous and not everybody's going to practice it the same way. It's not the same as giving someone, um, a medication. Where everybody gives that same medication, some version of it. Therapists vary in quality. They give heterogeneous experiences. People have different sensations or senses of their own skill at the craft.
mhm,
And it's very hard to evaluate the efficacy of therapy. Like
yes,
we know those limitations. Um,
yeah. Which is why I think that a more like kind of comprehensive or holistic approach, the way I see it, is like, let's say like a 12-year-old comes in to like a gender clinic with her parents, and is like, I want to transition, I'm trans, whatever. I think that the first step should be to have like to basically have there be like a few sessions with the parents and with the kids separately and then together,
yeah,
and to get a better like kind of a developmentally informed understanding of what this kid's experiences have been, because of course this kid might seem really smart and quirky now, but if they had a history of a speech delay or basically needing speech therapy, or if they have a history of toe walking, they might have not been diagnosed with a sensory processing disorder or a sensory integration disorder.
yeah.
But like it's and in the United States in particular, I know you're in Canada, but in the United States, if you switch insurance, good luck trying to find your old medical records.
Yeah.
Like it's not all in one place, and so clinicians don't actually have that to refer to in the diagnostic process most of the time. They're just seeing what's in front of them, and most parents are not going to think to basically outline their kid's entire kind of like developmental history of life struggles, so that this clinician can and the clinician doesn't know to ask about those things because they think that the gender thing is independent of those things. But in many cases, I mean, in all cases, our early lives shape us in a lot of ways, and like some of those ways are going to be really clinically significant in terms of like how do we actually help this kid like navigate through what is actually a really confusing process.
So
Like
I
it's
agree. I agree
really,
with the basic outlines of that argument, which is that obviously kids are kids. They don't have the perspicacity, the ability to sense, to understand themselves and to predict their futures. And we don't expect 12-year-olds to make a lot of consequential decisions. A lot of other things we obviously rely on parents and clinicians in most situations to be sort of the arbiters of like what is good clinic, what makes the most sense. And I think we've talked at length about what sort of the limitations have been in the gender world in terms of applying this. Like I said, one of the real challenges and where I think you get pushback from the gender community is that there was this belief that I once ascribed to, that gender identity is innate or nearly innate, starts early, it's immutable, can't be changed, and so why are you waiting? Like it's going to be stuck here forever. If you wait till someone's 18, they're going to transition anyways, and all you've done is waste time and give them more stuff on their plate to deal with when they're 18 to try to correct. That's always been sort of the traditional gender critical the gender supportive argument, and then you have the gender criticals who have come in, who kind of say things like gender is it's transient, it can be modified, it's a strategy, it's something people do to deal with other problems, and that you can eventually talk anybody out of it if given long enough. That it's not only that it's not immutable, innate and immutable, but that it's acquired and always mutable. You just need to find the right key to turn, and you will eventually sort of unlock the secret to solving someone's dysphoria.
yeah, that's naive.
Both those approaches are dumb, are wrong.
Yeah, yeah, they are.
Yeah,
Suddenly.
yeah. But I'm saying, but this is what's out there. This is what's out there. Either that you're going to be trans, so we have to transition you now, or we can eventually talk you out of trans, and then you're going to regret having gone through medicalization and the consequences of being of adopting a trans identity or of being exposed to the medicalization and surgical procedures that go along with that. And what we're really dealing with here is a data desert. We really don't know, and nobody who's honest will tell you what proportion of young boys or what proportion of young girls who are experiencing gender distress, with whatever cofactors might be present, will have persistent dysphoria at an age where you can say with confidence that it ain't going away. And then at that point is like, what would have been the better decision for that person to transition when they're big and male-bodied, or when they're female-bodied, or to have intervened sooner? And that's really, I think, the outlines of the proposals. We just don't have that data, and so we're operating in this kind of like, in basically feelsology, about what do we feel is the most likely in any given situation, and how do we manage that person appropriately? Because it's really, when it comes down to it, a lot of this is based on feels. And I know people who will say, well, if it's all based on feels, why are you doing it? Well, I'd say, well, some of the feels work both ways.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the problem with psychiatry. Like, some of this stuff is not even unique to gender medicine. It's just like a broader problem with psychiatry. It's just that most psychiatric interventions, even as catastrophic as some of them can be, a lot of them are like not as invasive, like not even remotely as invasive as transition. And so it's, that's why I think this issue is getting a lot more focused, just because of how invasive it is.
Don't get me wrong. It's super invasive.
Yeah.
It's super consequential. And I tend to use the word consequential just because, like, it has consequence. Like, if you do it, there's consequence you're going to have to deal with, good or bad, when it's done. My point is that, and I think this is something that, most gender criticals will admit, even if they minimize, is that we don't get to freeze time, which is that the psychological interventions themselves have minimal consequence. It's not the same as doing a mastectomy or putting someone on cross-sex hormones, but time is happening, and during time, especially during puberty, is consequential as well. Especially if we think someone has a high likelihood of eventually transitioning, they're going to be more likely to deal with those consequences later. Whereas if we believe that a person is more likely to age out of dysphoria, or maybe even faster with the support of therapy, well, then that makes perfect sense. We just don't have a good way of knowing who those people are and how big those groups are, how big those buckets are.
Yeah, and that's what makes it like difficult. I think, like from a clinical standpoint, is that no one actually knows. Yeah. Like, and it's kind of like at some point when you're dealing with someone who's in a phase of life where they're like large parts of their psychosocial development is kind of driven on developing identity.
Yeah.
By trying out lots of new things. Like, when the trouble, I think, as I see it, is that either you affirm them and they get stuck, and there's like this identity foreclosure that happens, or this, in the case of someone who's pretty autistic, trans becomes their special interest, and then being trans becomes, it's like the ultimate autistic dream.
Yeah, it's something to do.
In your special interest.
Yeah.
To live in your special interest.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like the most, like, that is like the most, like, archetypically autistic thing to do, is to find a special interest and then try to embody it somehow, and then like that interest can change. And then it's like, like, so that's kind of a scary prospect. And then on the other hand, you have this prospect of, well, if we don't affirm them, like, even if I don't buy the nonsense argument of like, oh yeah, all these kids are just going to like off themselves. Like, and it's because they haven't been affirmed. I kind of highly doubt that to be the case, with like, for that to be the reason, understanding how like psychiatrically complex this population is. I think that, but that doesn't mean that they don't have like distress that doesn't need to be contended with. They obviously, that needs to be the priority, right? Like, what I don't like about the strategy of the bans is that, like, while I agree that there's like, well, I agree with the, not with your opinion, but with the notion that there isn't, well, you and I actually both acknowledge the lack of like robust evidence in this area. But in terms of like, I'm at this point with this like total lack of evidence, and without the ability to have a high degree of certainty that we know who's going to persist and who's going to desist, with like intervening in that way in these kids' bodies,
yeah,
and in their like development, I still think that once you have basically told kids and their families from this kid's very young age, and nowadays more kids are being socially transitioned 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, that is extremely consequential. People, like clinicians, don't tell that to parents. They don't.
That's a totally separate area, and one that we probably agree on. Like, and I've written about this, that you probably shouldn't socially transition your kids unless you've really tried everything else. Like, it should not be done on a whim or what if. Wouldn't this be fun? Or, it's really got to be for some serious issues, and it should be medically supervised, even if it's not medicalized. But I think some people have been very blasé about socially transitioning prepubescents, thinking, oh, what's the big deal? They'll just grow it. If they grow out of it, they grow out of it. But I don't find that argument compelling. But like, the only way we're really going to get the answer here is, if not with a trial, but we're going to see over time, hopefully, what happens in places where bans are present, or what happens in places where care is more regimented or restricted, like in Sweden and Finland, and let's say what happens in Canada and Australia, where it's kind of still anything goes to some extent. And I recognize individual clinicians, even in Canada, are being a little more, practicing more discretion, and then we'll see in 10 years, like, where are the happy people? Who's detransitioning, who's transitioning later, how much mental health burden is there in the adult population in whom transition was not accessible, how much mental health burden is there among the patient who transitioned, who are now sort of stuck in other bodies. Those are the kind of data we really need to answer the question in terms of, like, well, what's actually going to happen in the States, and what's actually going to happen in Finland, and what's actually going to happen in Australia over the next few years as different places pursue different sets of policies.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a natural experiment in some regard, like, because there are these different places that have different policies, and and so, like, there are going to be different approaches. And I mean, gender medicine has done that, has kind of used that approach in a way, except, like, historically there has not been good documentation.
No,
there has not been very follow-up.
It's been terrible because everyone in the gender medicine group thought, like, this is so self-evidently beneficial that there was really no need to study it. At least study those questions. Like, the questions were focused on how do we help trans people live better, and how do we support trans people's mental health, which are important, but it wasn't sort of no one in the medical community was actually poised to ask the question of, like, is this actually working? Everyone just assumed that it was obvious that it did.
Mm. Well, there were some clinicians who actually even closed their practices because they didn't see their patients getting better. But those people had kind of opted out, and, like, this would have been, like, I don't know, in the 70s or something. I'm not sure. But then it was, like, resurrected because, of course, there are still going to be people who have
the needs weren't being met
to modify their bodies.
Yeah, the needs weren't being met. Yeah, like, you
right,
can say we're going to shut down the gender clinic, but it doesn't make dysphoria go away.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, like, that should actually be obvious. That's why I'm really, like, I've become very disillusioned, actually, by, like, both of the mainstream activisms in this regard, because people, the truth, as I see it, and actually when I came into activism, I still saw it this way. Like, a lot about kind of my thoughts have changed, but also a lot about my thoughts and kind of, like, my framings haven't changed. And I would consider myself to be a pretty pragmatic person, and I think that I lived most of my life up until this point in a young person's utopian fantasy. But I'm older and more mature, and I'm getting kind of old, almost 27, and I'm reflecting on everything, and I'm just, looking at the landscape around these conversations, and I'm just thinking, gosh, like, why is no one actually contending with reality? Like, everyone acts like they're contending with reality, but one side is basically, like, one side is, like, basically totally making light of extremely, as you would say, consequential decisions, and acting like it's no big deal and you can just kind of reverse course, and and then, like, if someone actually does reverse course, being like, oh, well, that was your fault for not knowing yourself at the age of 12, like, go F yourself,
Yeah.
And so there's that side, and then there's the other side that's basically like, well, when I was growing up, when we didn't have all these phones and fancy gadgets, like, none of these kids were having gender issues, and they were all just totally fine. And and that's obviously false too. Like, I think that like, the current gender dysphoric populations, they comprise different types of people that we've always had in society. And some of these people, mostly male people, like, there are some male people who just kind of have an almost, like, sort of compulsive drive to feminize themselves.
Yeah, and that's me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Like, it's just like a thing. And then, like, in terms of women, like girls and women, there have always been some women who have tried to live as men, or who have succeeded in living as men.
Yeah.
And they were sort of, so there were always people like that, but there's this new cohort, and there always been like, obviously, people who were like highly non-conforming, both in gender ways and outside of gender, in terms of their expression or whatever, right? Like,
Yeah.
there have always been these kind of autistic women and girls who are really socially awkward. And, I think this notion that I hear implicitly being expressed within the kind of gender critical communities that I disagree with is that the only reason that these girls are suffering is because they have been like exposed to the possibility of transition.
The gender
I
ideology.
don't think that's true. Yeah, I don't think that's true.
Yeah, they would have been suffering in some other way. Like,
Yes.
if gender ideology didn't exist,
Yes,
if you took it out of the schools and took it off the internet, is that these girls who are struggling to figure themselves out will find some other maladaptive strategy. And I don't know whether that maladaptive strategy is going to be better or worse than transitioning, because some of them are pretty bad. Is it going to be drug and alcohol use? Is it going to be eating disorders? Is it going to be, other type, falling into damaging relationships? Like, there's all sorts of other ways that people can screw their lives up. The gender one is pretty obvious to see, like, it's happening right in front of you, people, but I agree, like, these are people who are searching for a solution, and it just so happens, I believe, especially for the male female population, that transition was sort of the solution that was sort of easiest to access. Or not even the easiest to access, but the most sort of compelling in terms of, oh, here's the one that's most likely to be an actual solution, as opposed to a Band-Aid.
Yeah, and it's the most culturally salient. Like, if you think about what my generation was exposed to on social media, like, it's not as simple as like it's not as simple as the problem is that they're being exposed to it, and that if they weren't exposed to it, they wouldn't be having problems. Like, I think, and it's also not the inverse of, oh, like, these people have always been feeling this way, or this would have been the natural history of their condition. In all cases of people who think it would be, that would actually be the case, if they hadn't come across this possibility as like a very impressionable 12-year-old. It's a mixture of things, right? Like, there are temperamental factors, which we know to be largely genetic, and there are environmental factors, and all of us are a combination of nature and nurture and environment. Absolutely. Like, every single one of us, every aspect, like basically every single aspect of ourselves is it cannot really be attributable to just one factor. And so I think that anyone who has, everyone who doesn't really contend with the fact that, clearly transition has become the zeitgeist of a generation. It has become like the hero's journey of a certain subsection of troubled youth in a generation. Yeah. Like, that needs to actually be contended with for what it is, rather than pretending like, if we just stopped planting the seed, by like making this super culturally kind of available as like an idea, that's going to solve the problem. Because the fact remains that, like, yes, I think that the more people hear about the concept of transition or gender ideology or whatever you want to call it, the more people who hear about that, like, you're basically just casting a wider net, right? You're casting a wider net of people who could feel compelled by it, but like trans identities and gender dysphoria and these types of feelings that crop up, like, maybe in the early stages of adolescence, not necessarily for the first time, but like in a more structured way for the first time. Like, they were kind of the predisposing factors, I think, in a lot of like adolescents who present with gender dysphoria. If you listen to sort of like how they talk about their lives, it's not as if these were just totally like super happy, well-adjusted, typical kids.
Like, these were kids who were going to struggle in a lot of different ways, gender transition or not. And I think this is also where gender clinicians get sort of, I'm not going to say fooled, is that when they see like someone, let's say, who's transitioning and struggling post-transition, that they continue to have trouble with anxiety, depression, they continue to have struggle with eating disorders, they continue to struggle with fitting in, succeeding at school, staying employed, those types of things, that a lot of it has been, well, you would have been suffering anyways, which might be true. Like, these are people who were neurodevelopmentally and psychologically complex. and they would have been with or without the gender transition. But but what they would often say was, at least you're doing it in your true gender, as opposed to having to deal with all those problems in a body that was not a good fit for you. And that's always been the I'm trying to think of the word here, sort of the rationalization of why it's still okay to transition people who struggle. Like, I call these people the muddlers. Like, they're people who were muddling a little bit before, they're transitioning, they get a little bit of energy for the transition, but they still end up largely muddling after. But at least they're doing it in a woman's body or a man's body, which is more in keeping with what they wanted. They would have muddled either way. And they might have even muddled worse if we hadn't transitioned them. Because I think a lot of what clinicians tell themselves when they're faced with bad outcomes is that, well, this person would have been worse if they hadn't transitioned. And we actually don't know the answer to that, because we can never say, we can't rewind the clock and say, okay, now we're not going to transition you. You know, what kind of life do you have at 17? And I totally agree with you that I think gender criticals often paint this picture that if it wasn't for the evil gender fairy, that these people would have been, you know, valedictorian, or would have been, you know, typical, like, you know, high school sweetheart, you know, captain of the football team type people, if only the gender gremlin hadn't, you know, descended into their lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of people are wrong about this stuff. And I think that, like, you know, but that's not to, I don't know, like, human beings in their development, it's really complex. And the way I see it is like gender for a lot of people in my situation, and just like, you know, as I was transitioning and like more girls got into it, you know, there were some similarities and differences. Not all of them were autistic. I mean, some of them had like other issues that I would say were, you know, they didn't actually have the skills to get out of it once their lives got measurably worse. Because like for a lot of them, their lives did get measurably worse. Because I knew them before and I knew them during, and a lot of them, they weren't autistic, and they didn't have necessarily, like, in addition to being very emotionally dysregulated because they were young and often had, like, I don't know, like personality disorders, or they had, like, you know, that they developed due to like really early in life traumas.
Yeah,
like, trauma. Yeah. And like they didn't have like the emotional skills to, you know, nor did they have the IQ either. They were more kind of average, more in the kind of like average sort of, you know, on that kind of like that height of the bell curve where most people cluster, but they had like really significant emotional issues, and they had not developed another purpose in life that they could lean into once this was starting to really not work out for them. They just dug in deeper. They dug themselves in deeper, and they didn't have the sense to take things slowly and like,
be like, is my life really better? Is my life really better? Or I think it's also like the sunk cost, which is like, I've already pushed my transition so far along. The reason it's not working, like, and I'll speak from an empath perspective, the reason it's not working is because I don't pass. Or the reason it's not working is because I'm still tied to so much of my old life that it's dragging me down. And so one of the challenges of a transition, and I don't have a good solution here, is there's always one more thing. As opposed to being, maybe I should stop and pull back, there's always going to be one more thing to be, well, maybe if I got facial surgery, maybe if I was able to move away from my hometown in some place where nobody knows me, maybe if, you know, maybe, you know, if I get into this program and can finally make some money, you know, then things will get better. Because there's always going to be that maybe things will get better part of it. And I think because identity is so strong, like, so I think even when trans people, and I'm talking about maybe more about trans women, even when they're objectively struggling, just the idea of like going back, even though my life might have been materially better, that idea of going back and having to live as a man is completely disorienting, discombobulating, and terrifying. Like, even if someone said, we'll give you your house back, we'll give you your family back, we'll give you your car back, we'll give you your job back. If someone said that, even to someone who's struggling, would be like, no, my identity is more important. Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Because it's internal. You know, and like if someone said, like, we talk about like sexual orientation being obviously hard to change. Like, if you told someone who was gay, like in this, we saw this happening, like in generations past, where someone would come out as gay and they would lose everything. They would lose their family, they'd be shunned from their community. If they're in a religious community, they'd lose that. they'd often lose their job. They'd find themselves in a new community. They were living in a small apartment. They had lives that looked chaotic. They went from lives that looked organized to lives that looked chaotic. And someone could go up to that person too and say, hey, why don't you stop being gay? Go back. Let's say your wife will take you back. Your religious community will accept you as a sinner and let you repent. Go back. You can have that again, and it's easier. Like there's no you don't have to have like surgeries to to reverse the effects of hormones. You can just go back. You can walk right through that front door, and like if you could do that, how many gay men would do that?
Yeah, I mean
none. Or I shouldn't say none, but very few, because it's so internal to your sense of being, is your sexual orientation, and it's no different. And then once again, speaking from a male to female perspective, like if my life went to shit, my life thankfully is really good, but if my life went to shit and someone said, hey, all you need to do, cut your hair, get rid of these, go back, you'll have your life again. You can go be a doctor again. And people will accept you. Like, would I do that? Like, no, there's not a million years, because it's so core to my identity. Anyway, one thing, because I know we've been talking a long time, and I do want to wrap up, but I think it's the thing that sort of unites us, is that we both have the ability to talk about complicated subjects that are near and dear to our heart, and have obviously been highly consequential in our lives, with some level of remove, with some level of detachment, which I know is hard for trans people. Like, I talk about things that I think a lot of trans people have a lot of difficulty talking about, because it hits home. And we're talking about these things and trying to understand the other person's perspective. We're talking about them with nuance. But we're doing this in this very polarized environment, very toxic environment, where a lot of people's sense of worth is not, I'm going to say, tied to the toxicity, but tied to the absoluteness, the no compromise, the I am right. And, one of the things and how I've gotten to know you better is that I've seen you move, at least my perception, from being someone who went from a position of stridency, and I've done this too, I used to be a lot more strident too, to someone who is more contemplative and more nuanced and more open. How do we get more people into this arena where they're willing to abandon stridency and certainty and be willing to talk about these issues with compassion, with nuance, with curiosity, with an openness to change? Because I don't think this is going to get solved by people on opposite sides yelling at each other and calling each other names or attributing the worst possible motivations for their actions. I think it's going to get solved not just by me and you talking, but by thousands of me's and you's talking. How do we get the ball rolling here?
I think that there's a certain power to human relationships that a lot of people are unaware of. Like if we think about like how is it that the gay rights movement was able to get so much success, it was because, firstly, for a long time they really didn't, and then when they started to, it was because there was a hugely like assimilationist standpoint to it, and then also everyone, like when people started coming out as gay, everyone knew a gay person, and so there was a face put to it, and I think that at this point it seems like in most of the Anglophone West everyone knows a trans person at this point, and I think that within the next 10 years everyone will start to know a detransitioner, because there have been a lot of people who've transitioned and they're just like me. They're obviously different people, but in terms of ideology, it's just so many similarities. And I think that the biggest cause of regret in like a young transitioner, someone who began some facet of transition or another when they were very, very young, the biggest regrets that those people have, I think, is that they were not helped to actually understand themselves. Like they didn't understand their motivations. Like they thought they understood the motivations, and they didn't. And once they got older and they realized, like, wait a second, there's actually more to life than this, and I couldn't have accounted for how this would impact X, Y, and Z things. And now like my body's in pain because of these things I did to try to feel better, and actually that has made me kind of feel worse. and I didn't realize it when the pain might have been like when there might have been some treatment for it that could have brought me back to a state of health and wholeness, but I didn't recognize those signs when it was earlier in the process, and so I kept going along thinking that I just needed to do more and more and more. Like, I think that's an experience that a lot of people don't talk about as openly, but I think that it needs to be talked about more. And I think that, now, like, everyone knows a trans person. I think that soon maybe everyone will know detransitioner. And maybe that could be the thing that, like, kind of brings some nuance to it, because, like, not all
and I think that's important about, like, that knowing, because it's easy to talk about people in the abstract or as their stereotypes, and we've done this about transitioners, we've done this about detransitioners, about, like, all detransitioners are grifters, or all detransitioners are just people who can't accept that they made a mistake and are too weak to deal with they're too weak to deal with the challenges of transition. And I think it's not just knowing a transitioner, but knowing many types of detransitioners. Just like I think knowing many different types of transitioners, like trans acceptance, when you say, like, with gay people it helped to know one, I think with trans people it helps. It really depends on the trans person you know.
Yeah.
How well you know them.
Oh, yeah.
Because sometimes you see a trans person, you're like, I do not want this for my children. I don't want this near me. And there's sometimes when you meet a trans person, you're like, this person's actually really got an interesting story, and they're kind of cool, and they've got a fully formed life. And if my child was gender dysphoric and ended up like her or like him, I'd be like, well, that's how it goes. As opposed to, I cannot accept this. So I think the more you realize that we are multitudes, and that we're not the worst of us, I think also is, can be very helpful in terms of getting acceptance to people at whatever stage of the gender journey they're at, whatever path they happen to be taking.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think that, knowing many different types of people would be helpful, but also, the two of us, we are, like, far more fixated on this topic than most people are.
Well, we have our reasons.
Yeah, of course, right? Like, everyone has their own special interests.
There's some people I'm wondering, like, why do you care so much?
Yeah, I know. I get that too. I'm like, well, like, what is this?
It's like, if I got really, like, interested in, like, Kazakhstani politics for some reason and posted about it nonstop as if it was the most consequential thing in the world, I wonder, like, there's some people who are like, why is this so motivating? Why do you spend 14 hours a day, looking to get angry at trans people, or looking to get angry about, like, what is your motivation here?
Or to get angry about, like, detransitioners, because there are some people who are just, like, not trans, not detrans. They like, I don't even know what's going on. I mean, I'm not going to name their Twitter accounts, but, like, I have, like, at least 5 that I could just think of off the top of my head. And they basically, like, hate detransitioners. And there are some people, an even smaller section, and these people I find really interesting. Yeah. They hate trans people, and they also hate detrans people with, like, equal fervor.
Oh, really?
Actually, I find those people to be the most honest. I'm like, okay, so you just don't like gender weirdos. Like, that's your prerogative, right? Yeah. Those people are actually, I find, more interesting to try to get into their minds of, like, what is behind their strong opinions. But the other people, it's just genuinely, like, kind of confusing, and for reasons that I'm not particularly, like, curious and trying to figure out how do we get the answers from certain people, like, why they've become so obsessed with the subject. But I think there are lots of reasons, right? Like, I think that this is a sex and gender and identity, and
it's core to human being, human nature, and for all I know, a lot of these people maybe have been touched by the issue in ways that aren't always immediately apparent. Right. Whether personally, like, I do believe there are some people who are fighting their own demons on it, and I do believe there's some people who have someone in the family who struggled with it, and maybe have struggled in a way that was not good, that they're not necessarily sharing. But whatever. I know that's a bit of an aside. I do, like, I know we've been talking for a few hours here, both with Yvette and I, and then just the two of us on our own. We'll bring Yvette back in later to watch this, and then she can sort of critique or add her opinions in. But any last words to our audience before we wrap up today?
Well, I think that if I were to, last words. Well, I think that, like, my kind of, in my ideal world, young people who are struggling with gender issues, but really ideally this would be a protocol that would apply to anyone of any age, because I think that everyone who's going to embark upon something as consequential as this, like they deserve to actually be properly kind of treated. And in my opinion, like ideally, the kind of going forward, if someone were to present with gender issues, I guess like, yeah, in my ideal world, there would be more of an inclusion of like speech therapists and occupational therapists, and physical therapists and people that will help with social skills and sensory integration, because a lot of the things that, like, a lot of the like kind of deficits, the sensory issues and the social deficits that a lot of autistic people have, that do cause them a lot of psychosocial and embodied distress, those things will not go away whether they desist or whether they persist. Like they're issues that are very likely to just get worse with time, and maybe transition like could make some of those things worse, or it might be a mask for some of those things, if that, where it is being used as a strategy in that way. And so, like, in my ideal world, a truly exploratory process would be where you explore, like, what is the profile of this individual and their family, and like what has their developmental trajectory been like, and what are the stages of support that they're going to need, like, holistically, that will help them to be a functioning person. And I think that with the right type of support, and it isn't just like psychotherapy, because like you're not going to benefit from psychotherapy if
like some people, like I said, when they transition, they pick up the things fairly easily. Like they pick up like how to succeed in this new gender role, or at least how to get by in this new gender role fairly quickly, and other people really struggle with it, and it makes their lives so much harder. And I know this is sort of maybe peripheral to your point, but it's semi-related. I know in the MTF community we used to talk about things like charm school, like, and not so much about how to like walk straight up and down or balance a book on your head, but really, like, a lot of people, who, especially from the MTF space, who enter into your transition, have only the vaguest idea of what it means to be legible as a woman, and to move through the world in a way that people will accept you. And I know this is going to be gender critical. It's going to jump down my throat by saying, like, you don't know nothing. Like, what do you know, boy? But there really are things to pick up. And a lot of people struggle with this, and I'm sure it works both ways because they really don't know. You can't know what it's like to live in that role unless you've done it for a number of years, unless you really have the skills to pick it up. But you're right. Like, we all probably could use a lot more support, whatever path we take, to help us understand our motivations better, and to also help us succeed on whatever path we end up sticking down.
Yeah, and like I think that just in general as well, like, distress there's a certain aspect of like being embodied and being alive that predisposes us to like distress. I mean, we start dying from the moment we're born, right? Like, it's all pretty bleak if you think about it. Every day
I think, like, oh, is today the day that I get that weird pain that ends up being like this cancer? Like, is today the day that vessel bursts? Like, we're having a nice conversation here, but I could stroke out later today, and that'd be that. That's part of the challenge of being embodied.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that challenge, I think that, like, adolescents in the midst of puberty, they need to be supported through that. And, like, without a specific goal other than how do we help you feel better in the body you have now? And that could mean, like, this person has already started taking hormones. But that it doesn't mean that they wouldn't still benefit from, or they wouldn't still benefit from, like, sensory integration therapy, because the sensory issues, like, if the sensory issues are so severe that it's basically causing you to be totally unable to process your emotional distress, because it becomes part and parcel of the emotional distress. And with the speech delay or the communication issue, you're going to basically latch onto whatever script gives you words to articulate whatever the distress is, and you will be totally like, kind of unable to parse through any of it, regardless. And I think that, honestly, at every stage of this journey, like, I think that, obviously, like, not making rash decisions, and especially for very young people, like teenagers, I think that there really needs to be, like, a robust effort made to help these kids, like, feel better in their bodies as much as possible now. Like, not to wait for some waiting list, and maybe they'll make it into a gender clinic or not, or to, because you don't want your kid to go down the gender clinic route, to just be like, they'll just figure it out on their own. Like, the chances of that happening are like the chances that this is just going to kind of go away on its own and that this kid is just going to feel comfortable in themselves, this is like very, I think it's very slim. Like in a lot of these cases where there are really pervasive like neurodevelopmental issues, that is going to be an aspect of this person's embodiment probably like forever, and they need to learn how to contend with that so that they can actually make rational
and whether part of that contention ends up being medicalization or whether part of that is not, it can be done without it, I think is a very individualized decision. So Maia, thank you for joining me for like extra time, even without Yvette, and thank you obviously for joining us in the past few shows. There's going to be a lot of Maia content when this finally does come to air. And as always, like I really, like I said, I'm glad I made the choice to let you back into my life, because I kind of pushed you away for a while, because especially during a more strident phase, I just found it too much. And I'm really glad that you gave an opportunity for me to welcome you back into life and to have these conversations again. They're among, in the gender world, they're among the ones I've most enjoyed. And I think our audience, particularly anyone in the audience who stuck it out to the end, will find this to be very rewarding. And I hope more people are having these.
Likewise, I hope we can model a better way forward, because this is like valuable information, I think, for anyone who actually cares about what's best for these populations. And I've also really enjoyed conversing with you over the course of time. And obviously I've become a lot more mature. I mean, I've become much less adolescent and rigid in my thinking, and I think for a lot of people that's just a developmental thing. And one would hope that as someone gets from their early to their mid to their late 20s, that their thinking would kind of complexify. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. But I mean, I just think that it's really important to have conversations between people who have like an actual desire to like get down to the truth, whatever it is, however multifaceted it is. And so I want to extend the thank you to you and to Yvette and to your whole audience for kind of engaging in this project of like genuine truth seeking and like entertaining cognitive dissonance and complex thought. So thank you to everyone who's watching. Thank you to you and Yvette for hosting this podcast. And it's been a real pleasure to get to know you over the course of the last couple of years.
Yeah, likewise. Bye, everyone.
Wow.